What time is it where you are right now? Are you lying back, breathing slowly, the lights low? Maybe imagining a loaf of bread. Warm, crusty, simple. Let's take a closer look. Not at the kind you're picturing, but at the kind you'd be forced to eat in the Middle Ages, when bread could kill you slowly, or all at once. In the medieval world, bread was more than a staple. It was survival. And for most people, it wasn't fluffy or fragrant or soft. It was dark, coarse and heavy, sometimes spiked with ground beans, sometimes bulked out with sawdust, and sometimes laced, unknowingly, with toxins. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Bread started with grain, and grain started with land. But if you were a peasant, which you probably were, that land wasn't yours. You worked it, harvested it, threshed it, then gave the best portion to your lord or the church. You kept the rest, and that grain, it was precious. So you had to make it last, dry it, store it, and then, when the time came, grind it. That's where the first danger lay. Grinding grain wasn't something you did freely. Milling was tightly controlled. Most villagers were required to use the lord's mill, for a fee, of course. Sometimes you had to walk miles to reach it. The miller, usually a robust and sly man, kept a portion of the flour as his right. He was not loved. Millers were often portrayed in medieval stories as cheats, tricksters, the kind who'd weigh down their sacks with stones or sweep up spilled grain and toss it back into the hopper, dust, dirt, rat droppings and all. So your flour, by the time you got it, was not clean. It was flecked with husk. It was coarse and dark. And worse, if it had been stored too long or gotten wet, it might be laced with ergot, a toxic fungus that grew on rye. Ergot poisoning, or St. Anthony's fire, wasn't rare. It twisted fingers into claws. It made people hallucinate. Their limbs turned black and crumbled. Entire villages thought they were cursed, and still they kept eating because it was that or nothing. Bread came in grades. The wealthy could afford white bread, sifted flour, clean, soft. Monks and nobles might eat manchet bread, light and well risen. The poor got maslin, a mix of wheat and rye, or worse, horse bread, made of peas, beans, and anything else grindable. But even horse bread was better than no bread. You baked at home, or you didn't bake at all. Some towns had communal ovens, but they cost money. Firewood was scarce, and baking took time. And if you tried to sell bread without permission, without the stamp of the local guild or a license, from the crown you could be fined, or worse, pilloried. In 1266, the assize of bread set the rules in England. How much a loaf should weigh, how much it should cost, how it should be inspected. Inspectors, called aliconers or bread weighers, went from stall to stall, lifting loaves, sniffing for rot, checking for mold. But corruption was easy. A few coins slipped into the right palm, and suddenly your worm-eaten loaf was perfectly legal. Of course, that didn't help the buyer. The woman who spent her only coin on what she thought would feed her child for 2 days, only to find it sour, hollow, or half-ash. But again, it was that, or starve. And so people ate. They dunked their bread in broth. They soaked it in beer. They broke it into pottage. They softened it with tears and chewed slowly, because bread, even when it was foul, filled the belly. And when the belly was full, the body could work. And if the body could work, the tithe could be paid, and if the tithe could be paid, well, life could go on, barely. But what happened when the bread ran out? What happened in bad years? Years. When the crops failed, or the rivers flooded, or the miller's wheel cracked and no one could afford repairs. What did people turn to when there was no flour, no grain, and no bread? That's a story for another section. No grain, no flour, no bread. In medieval Europe, a failed harvest wasn't just bad news. It was catastrophe. Grain prices didn't rise slowly in bad years. They spiked overnight. A penny's worth of rye might double in cost in a week. That was more than a poor man's weekly wage. And remember, bread was the foundation of most meals. No grain meant no food. Full stop. The landscape of famine wasn't just hunger, it was fear, quiet desperation, fields stripped of weeds, children digging for roots, entire villages picking through animal feed, or worse, grinding bark and grass into flour. They called it famine bread. You'd mix whatever you could find. Chestnuts, acorns, fern roots, even powdered bones or ash. The bread came out grey, dense, inedible really. But people ate it anyway because the ache in their belly made anything seem edible. Then the sickness would come. Famine bread carried more than splinters and toxins. It was a breeding ground for dysentery, for worms, for slow gut-twisting death, and still they ate and they fought. In cities, when bread ran out, riots began. Bakers' stalls overturned, ovens smashed. Lords pleaded for calm, but calm was hard to come by when your child hadn't eaten in 3 days. Authorities would respond not with food but with punishment. They made examples, hanged bread thieves in market squares, pilloried mothers who stole a crust from the Lord's wagon. And still, more came. In 1315 it rained, and it kept raining, for months. Across Europe, crops drowned, granaries emptied, the Great Famine killed. Millions, not just from hunger but from the diseases that followed. Weakened bodies couldn't resist the plagues that came in its wake, and when it was over, nothing changed, because the system stayed the same. The mill still belonged to the Lord. The bread still had to be weighed. The tithes still had to be paid. In the countryside, some villagers turned to the forest, poaching deer, foraging mushrooms, digging up wild onions. But this too was dangerous. Poaching was a hanging offense, and many of the plants that grew wild were either poisonous or nearly impossible to digest. Survival became a kind of expertise, a game of guesses, which bark could be ground and baked, which flour wouldn't make you sick, which parts of the pig were safe when green, how much mold was too much. People learned to dry nettles into flour, to boil dock leaves, to chew on boiled leather. Children would suck on stones to keep the hunger at bay. And yet, life didn't stop. Weddings still happened. Babies were still born. And every once in a while, a loaf of real bread, soft, warm, made from true wheat, would appear in someone's hands. Perhaps a traveling merchant, a nobleman's gift, a bribe from the bishop. And that moment, the feel of soft crust breaking between fingers, the smell of roasted grain, the warmth of something not laced with death, that was power. Bread wasn't just food, it was control, a weapon, a promise, and some people learned to use that. There were bread guilds, groups of bakers sworn to uphold the weight and purity of each loaf. They had seals, banners, even patron saints. Saint Honoratus in France, Saint Elizabeth in Hungary. But even the guilds weren't immune to corruption. Sometimes the bread was fine, sometimes it was dust, and sometimes it was poison, not because anyone meant to, but because rats had gotten into the flour or the oven wasn't hot enough, or the storage room had flooded and no one told the baker. One wrong turn, one spoiled sack, one bad guess, and death came quietly as a loaf passed hand to hand. Bread killed more people than many wars, and yet people never stopped baking, never stopped eating, never stopped hoping that the next loaf would be better, cleaner, safe. And yet, how did bread shift from survival to status? How did white bread, once the food of kings, become something the poor would crave and never taste? That's what we'll explore next. By now, you've seen bread as survival, as famine, as quiet suffering passed down, generation by generation. But there was another side to bread, a shinier one. One bleached, puffed, softened, and lifted by pride. White bread. In the medieval world, white bread wasn't just food. It was a signal, a banner of wealth, a social separator baked into every crust. To get white bread, you needed pure wheat flour. That meant sifting, over and over, until all the bran and husk were removed. It meant flour that was milled, clean, stored dry, and handled with care. It meant access to the best ovens, the best bakers, and most importantly, it meant money. Manche bread, the whitest of all, was made only for the elite, nobles, bishops, wealthy merchants. It was rolled smooth, shaped precisely, and sometimes even decorated before baking, served with honey dipped in wine, placed at the center of golden platters. But here's the truth, it wasn't always better. In fact, it was often worse for you. White bread had fewer nutrients. It lacked the fiber, the fat, the iron of rougher loaves. It filled the stomach quickly but did little to sustain the body. The rich, bloated on soft loaves and sweetmeats, often suffered from gout, constipation, and malnutrition in ways the peasants did not, but they didn't care. White bread meant status, that's all. You might say it still does. And while the rich dined on fine bread, what did the rest eat? The same thing they always had. Maslin, horse bread, flat, gritty loaves, mixed with beans, peas, acorn flour, or anything else they could grind. Bread so dense it could last a week. Bread you had to soften with stew. The first protest was often against the baker. His stall smashed, his loaves stolen, his name cursed. But it wasn't personal. Bread was symbolic. To take it was to reclaim dignity. To burn it was to send a message. In 1381, during the peasants' revolt in England, one of the first targets wasn't a king but a grain clerk, a man who counted loaves, weighed sacks, and punished those who baked too much or too little. They tore his ledgers, burned his office, scattered flour across the streets. In France, centuries later, bread prices would fuel an entire revolution. Let them eat cake, someone said, or didn't say, and people starved anyway. In each case, it wasn't just about food. It was about fairness, because bread, so simple, so humble, so necessary, had become the thread tying people to their suffering. And still they baked, even when they knew the miller was cheating them, even when the oven scorched the crust, even when the flour was moldy or the yeast had turned sour. They baked because bread filled the air with a promise, warmth, normalcy, something solid to hold on to when everything else fell apart. And so today, when you tear into a baguette or slice a soft roll, it's easy to forget the history behind that act, the weight of labor behind every crumb, the price of survival behind every bite. Not long ago, bread wasn't a comfort, it was a gamble. One bite might carry you to morning, the next might carry you to fever, and yet people ate, quietly, gratefully, hungrily, because that's what humans do. So next time you see a stale loaf, a crust too hard, a heel you'd normally toss, maybe pause, because once, not so long ago, that crust could have meant the difference between life and death. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the edge of a medieval village. A low-roofed cottage with a crooked chimney, smoke curling from the thatch. Outside, a woman stirs something in a blackened pot. The smell is strange, earthy, sweet, almost sour. That scent? It's ale. And the woman? She's an alewife. Before beer halls and breweries, before hops and glass bottles, before bearded monks became the face of brewing, there were women, thousands of them, stirring, fermenting, pouring and selling, from cramped kitchens, from market stalls, from corners of tiny dirt-paved towns. They brewed beer, not as a craft, not as a hobby, but as survival. In the medieval world, water wasn't safe. Wells teemed with waste, streams ran with runoff, and so people drank ale, even children. Weak ale, small beer, sometimes less than 2% alcohol, just enough to kill the bugs, just enough to keep the belly settled, and someone had to make it. That someone, more often than not, was a woman. The job of brewing fell neatly into the category of household work, along with baking, gardening, child-rearing, and keeping the fire alive. Brewing was domestic, expected, invisible, until it wasn't. The alewife wasn't just a mother with a pot. She was a chemist in her own right, working with grains, watching fermentation, tasting for spoilage, timing the heat, adding herbs. Groot, they called it, a mix of bog myrtle, yarrow, horehound, rosemary, whatever grew near, whatever lent bitterness, whatever kept the brew from rotting in a few hours' time. Each brew was different. No recipes, no written instructions, no clocks, just instinct, touch, taste and failure. A bad batch might curdle, turn sour, go flat. And with no refrigeration, timing was everything. Ale had to be brewed, cooled, barreled and sold, sometimes all in one day. If she got it right, the alewife could earn a few pennies, enough to buy meat or save up for shoes. If she got it wrong, her family might go hungry, or worse, people might get sick. In some towns, alewives were respected, seen as necessary, trusted. In others, they were something else entirely. By the 13th and 14th centuries, brewing became regulated. Towns began inspecting barrels, measuring alcohol, checking weights, taxing sales, and suddenly, what had once been humble, invisible labor became power, and that made people uneasy. You see, alewives made money, real money. In some cases more than their husbands, and money meant independence. And independence in a patriarchal feudal society was dangerous. So came the pushback. Some towns required women to register, others banned them entirely. Men formed brewing guilds and closed the doors behind them. Accusations started flying: watered ale, false measures, corrupt scales, and worse, witchcraft. Yes, brewing, once seen as honest work, was suddenly painted with suspicion. The pointed hat, the cauldron, the broom, all linked to alewives. The tall hat made them visible in crowded markets. The cauldron was just for brewing. The broom hung above the door to signal ale was ready for sale. But rumors don't care about truth. Slowly, steadily, alewives were pushed out, replaced by male brewers, by monks in cloisters, by guilds with rules and fees. Some women resisted, others vanished into poverty, but their knowledge didn't disappear. It remained in whispers, in herbs passed hand to hand, in recipes spoken, never written. So tonight, as you sip your drink, whatever it may be, think of her, the woman with flour on her apron and soot on her face, the one who boiled and stirred and hoped, who made safe drink from spoiled grain, who fed her family, not with a sword or a sermon, but with yeast, time and fire. And ask yourself, why did we forget her? Why was the alewife remembered only as a joke or a warning or a witch? That's what we'll uncover next. The transformation didn't happen overnight. At first, the alewife was respected, necessary, even essential. She kept the ale flowing, not for fun, not for celebration, but because without it villages could barely function. Farmhands needed it, children relied on it. Priests, millers, merchants, all drank weak ale like water, because it was water, cleaned by boiling, stabilized by fermentation. And in the beginning, no one cared who brewed it, as long as it didn't make them sick. But that changed, not because the ale got worse, but because the women got better. They got good at brewing, good at marketing, good at building their own little empires, one pot at a time. They hung brooms outside their doors, signaling fresh batches. They sold by the cup or by the crock. Some even hired help, and that's when power noticed. In England, alewives were suddenly accused of dishonest practices. In court records from the 14th century, you'll find their names scattered across fines and warnings, not just for spoiled ale, but for excessive profit, for misleading customers, for daring to sell too well. You see, the issue wasn't that the ale was bad. It was that the woman making it was doing too well, so the town elders created rules. You could only sell at certain times. You needed a license. You needed to be inspected. You had to pay fees, and those fees added up. Many couldn't afford them. Others were deliberately excluded, their licenses denied, their inspections rigged, their names dragged through the mud. And so the image of the alewife began to sour. In medieval art and verse, she went from hard-working matron to comic villain. Her apron stained, her smile sly, her jug full of deceit. She became a character, one meant to be laughed at, or pitied, or feared. And then came the church. You might expect monasteries to support these women. After all, monks brewed ale too, often quite good ale, in fact. But the church had its own goals. It wanted order, control, authority. Alewives, with their bubbling cauldrons and knowledge of herbs and fermentation, didn't fit the mold. They weren't monks. They weren't licensed. They weren't contained. And worse, they didn't need men to survive. So suspicions grew. People whispered, how could a woman know so much about bitterness and strength and timing and taste? How could she turn raw grain into gold? The answer, for some, was obvious. Magic. And magic meant danger. So the line between alewife and witch began to blur. It wasn't always spoken aloud, but it lingered. The broom, the bubbling pot, the herbs on the shelf. The strange hours, the smoke, the laughter, the profit, it was too much. And when the great witch trials swept through Europe, many women accused of sorcery had one thing in common. They were brewers, or midwives, or herbalists. They had knowledge. That couldn't be read in a book, only felt, taught, lived. It's worth noting that in cities where brewing became male-dominated, witch accusations fell. Coincidence? Or consequence? Meanwhile, brewing guilds were forming, mostly male. Expensive to join, built around recipes, scales, written instructions, things women had long done by memory. In these spaces, ale became standardized, consistent, profitable, and plant the wildness was gone. The experimentation, the herbs, the crooked batches and strange flavors and half-remembered wisdoms passed from mother to daughter. Gone, ale was now business, and the alewife. She became a relic, a warning, a joke in woodcuts and tavern songs, a hag hunched over a pot. A woman, too bold, too free, too much. But she wasn't gone, not entirely. She lingered in rural corners, in forgotten recipes, in the ashes of hearths where women still stirred small batches for feast days, for funerals, for friends. And in those spaces the truth remained, that for hundreds of years, before monks bottled their first brew, before men opened their first beer halls, the best ale in the beginning, ale was wild. It was herbal, earthy, unstable, it spoiled fast. Tasted different from village to village, even from pot to pot. It was a drink shaped by hands, by instinct, not science. Not yet. But in the late Middle Ages, a slow, bitter revolution was brewing. Hops, tiny, papery flowers, pale green, sharp to the tongue, bitter, preserving. Hops weren't new. They'd been known since Roman times, but they weren't widely used in English or early French brewing. Alewives and early brewers in general used grute, a mix of local herbs. Myrtle, heather, mugwort. Each brewer had their own mix, their own secrets. But grute was expensive, unpredictable. Hops were different. They did more than flavor the drink. They stabilized it, made it last longer, travel farther, kept it from spoiling. Hopped beer didn't sour in 2 days like ale. It could be shipped, stored, sold across borders, and that, more than anything, changed the game. Suddenly brewing wasn't just household work. It was commerce, trade, export, and that meant men. Men who had land, men who had scale, men who had the ears of kings and abbots and city councils, men who could build large breweries with copper kettles and hired hands and wagons to haul the product into the next town and the next and the next. Alewives, they brewed for neighbors. But these men, they brewed for armies. The church embraced hopped beer, so did the crown. In Germany, laws like the Reinheitsgebot of 1516 codified ingredients: water, barley, hops. Not grute, not herbs, not instinct. This was the age of regulation and the age of forgetting. Alewives and their herb-wrought brews were written out. Their methods weren't standardized. Their records didn't exist. Their traditions were oral, ephemeral, delicate, passed from hands roughened by labor, not written into parchment bound by law, and so they vanished. And in their place came the monk, the merchant, the male brewer in an apron with scales and accounts and sealed casks, and the beer changed too. Where ale had been cloudy, beer was clearer. Where ale soured quickly, beer lasted weeks. Where ale carried hints of rosemary and bog myrtle, beer tasted bitter, uniform, clean. And slowly, the very word alewife began to disappear. By the 1600s, if someone said brewer, they meant a man. In some corners, rural women still brewed, quietly, privately. Their ale wasn't sold in taverns. It was served in kitchens, at weddings, during sowing and reaping festivals. A mug passed between neighbors. A flavor remembered but not recorded. But the era of public, profitable, powerful female brewing was over. Still, traces remain. In some traditions, women still brew with herbs their grandmothers used. In parts of Scandinavia, sati is still made raw unboiled ale flavored with juniper, stirred in wooden tubs. In farmhouse kitchens across Belgium, small batch brews live on, echoing forgotten hands. And in stories, the ones not written down, the alewife still stirs her pot, she still tastes with her finger. Times the fermentation by scent and feel, throws in a twist of nettle or thyme, waits, hopes that the drink is good, that it brings warmth, that it makes the day a little more bearable. And that's the legacy we often miss, that before beer was a business, it was a kindness, a gift, a safety, made by women who knew that sometimes the difference between illness and health and between death and life was something as small and humble as a warm cup of weak ale. And so the next time you drink, whether it's ale or beer, domestic or imported, bitter or sweet, remember the hands that stirred before kettles had thermometers, before hops had names, before breweries had signs. Remember the alewife, the woman behind the curtain of steam, the keeper of fermentation and flame, the forgotten brewer of forgotten safety, and wonder if so much could be lost with the arrival of a flower. What other lives have vanished under the hammer of progress? Picture this. You're walking down a cobbled street in a medieval town. It's mid-morning. The air is thick, a mix of roasting meat, hot bread, sweat, dung, and river rot. Criers shout their prices. Stallholders wave their arms. Dogs weave between legs. And everywhere, food, piles of it, out in the open. Fish on wooden planks, their eyes cloudy. Trussed birds hung by the feet, flies crawling over their beaks. Milk, curdling in the sun, greens wilting on wet cloth, pork that smells. Just slightly wrong. This was your supermarket. And if you were hungry, you didn't have the luxury of suspicion, because food poisoning wasn't a theory. It was just life. You bought what you could afford. You asked no questions. You prayed. The stomach pains wouldn't come. In the medieval world, most food was local, seasonal, and perishable. That sounds romantic today, but it was deadly then. There was no refrigeration, no plastic, no expiration dates. Preserving food meant drying, salting, smoking, or pickling, all expensive, time-consuming, and often limited to the wealthy, or to winter stocks. For everyone else, food was eaten quickly or spoiled. So imagine meat left out on a hot afternoon. Fish caught 3 days ago but sold today. Cheese riddled with maggots and still sold because maggots were protein. Sometimes sellers used tricks. They'd rub meat with ash to hide discoloration, cover rot with herbs, wash slimy cuts in vinegar, soak bad cheese in brine, reboil spoiled stew and call it fresh. No one wanted to be caught, of course, but market inspectors were rare, overworked, easily bribed. In theory, cities had laws. London, a butcher could be fined for selling green meat. In Paris, fishmongers were watched. In Florence, bread was weighed. But these measures were spotty, inconsistent, and usually ignored when hunger rose and tempers fell. And even when a merchant was punished, what then? He paid a fine, moved stalls, started again. The sick had no recourse, no proof, no refund. So people learned to live with risk, to smell before biting, or to boil water, to salt the soup heavily, to drink ale, not water, to cook the hell out of everything. But even then, sickness came. They called it the flux, sudden, wrenching illness, or the sweats, fevers from spoiled meat, or fever of the belly, bloating, vomiting, purging, and sometimes you didn't survive it, especially children, especially the old, especially anyone with a weakened body or an empty stomach, which meant often the poor food poisoning wasn't a mystery. It was predictable. You bought bad food, you got sick, you might die, but you still bought it because you had to eat. And fresh food, that was for the rich, the powerful, the noble households with dedicated kitchens and private gardens, the monasteries with smokehouses and root cellars. For everyone else, food was a gamble. A bite could keep you alive, or drop you where you stood. And yet somehow people adapted. They learned the signs of spoilage, they trusted certain vendors, avoided others. They passed knowledge down. Which baker watered his flour, which butcher reused his skewers, which fishmonger sold last week's catch with new eyes sewn in. Yes, really, old tricks. Fake eyes made from beads. Fresh blood painted onto pork. Rancid butter whipped smooth and reshaped. The market was a theater, and survival meant knowing the backstage. But when did all this start to change? What moment in history first tried to truly fix the rot? Was it a plague year, a royal decree, a fire that swept the market clean, or something smaller, a woman with a knife cutting open a bad apple and refusing to sell it? That's what we'll look at next. There is something both beautiful and brutal about a medieval marketplace. On the surface, noise, barter, color, but underneath, strategy, memory, revenge. Vendors who tricked too many were remembered. Not always. Punished, but remembered. And memory, in the absence of law, was survival. By the 14th century, some cities began to formalize food safety, not out of compassion, but because rot led to riots. When spoiled meat caused stomach cramps in the wrong household, a merchant's wife, a priest, a visiting official, the complaints grew louder. So, towns responded. They created positions. Meat inspectors, fish examiners, market wardens. They wrote ordinances, the earliest versions of food laws. In London, 1322, butchers were forbidden to sell meat more than a day old. In Paris, 1350, fish had to be sold on stone slabs, not wood, to avoid contamination. In Milan, inspectors had the right to dump barrels of bad wine directly into the street, but there was a catch, always. These inspectors were usually unpaid, or poorly paid. Their power depended on local politics. Their loyalty could be bought, with bread or a coin or a favor, and so the dance continued. Some sellers cooperated, others fought back, hiding bad cuts, reselling forbidden goods in back alleys, mixing in spoiled stock at night when no inspectors walked the lanes. So towns took it a step further. Public shaming. A bad baker might be pilloried with a burned loaf around his neck. A fish seller might have rotten fish hung from his stall with a sign, "Unfit." Some were fined, some were jailed. Some, in the worst cases, were beaten or exiled. And yet, enforcement remained uneven. One market might be tightly run. Another, just 2 streets over, might be a chaos of flies and shouting and spoilage. The difference often came down to one thing: leadership. In cities where local councils had strength and pride, food markets became symbols of civic order. Clean stalls, regulated prices, inspections. In weaker towns, it was a free-for-all. Even the church played a role. Monasteries often sold surplus food, cheese, ale, dried meats, and they had reputations to uphold. How spoiled cheese from a friar's cellar brought shame. So monks monitored their goods carefully. Many maintained strict rules of storage, temperature, and rotation long before refrigeration. Still, decay won more often than it lost. In summer, months, the rot came faster than inspectors could walk, especially in meat markets. Butchers hacked animals apart in open air. Blood pooled. Bones were stacked. Guts thrown to the street. Flies buzzed in clouds. Even in winter, the cold didn't always help. Meat stored improperly froze unevenly, thawed midday, refroze at night. The result? Bacteria, not yet understood, but deeply felt in the gut. Fish markets were worse. The smell alone could knock you back. Some cities banned fish stalls near churches or official buildings. Others relegated them to riverside alleys, where runoff could carry the waste away. But still the poison spread. Not all of it fatal. Sometimes it was just a night of cramps, or a fever, or a child who didn't stop vomiting. And sometimes it's a funeral. And in the absence of modern science, people blamed what they understood. They blamed the air, the stars, the devil, or their neighbors. Food poisoning didn't have a name, but it had a face, and it often wore the mask of the foreigner, the outsider. The poor merchant trying to sell too much too fast, Xenophobia rose with the stink of rot. In times of plague and famine, market stalls were targeted, destroyed, foreign vendors chased out, markets burned for cleansing. And with every fire, the system reset. New rules, new stalls, new promises of safety, until it all happened again. Because until cold storage arrived, and with it, modern health inspections, the battle between rot and regulation never truly ended. But there were exceptions, small towns, hidden corners, women and men who took pride in their stalls, who knew their customers by name, who gave an extra plum for free, or refused to sell yesterday's meat even when money was tight. They didn't call it ethics. They called it survival, reputation, dignity, because in the end, even the poorest vendors knew. A good name lasts longer than a spoiled apple. But how did the knowledge of food spoilage spread? When did people begin to understand what made them sick, not just suspect it? Was it through trial and error, or through books, scientists, and sudden revelation? We'll explore that next. For centuries, medieval people lived with the consequences of spoiled food, without understanding its cause. They didn't know about bacteria, they didn't know about salmonella, E. coli, or botulism. They only knew this: some food made you sick, and from that knowledge they built a system, flawed but familiar, based on memory, trust, pattern, rumor, superstition. If meat turned green, don't eat it. If the cheese stung the nose, avoid. Tell us, Dave, if the stew fizzed, if the fish gleamed too much, if the bread crumbled too quickly. Something was wrong. It was a world ruled by gut instinct. But instinct had its limits. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe slowly began to shift. Enlightenment thinkers, doctors, chemists, philosophers, started to suspect what we now take for granted. That disease might come from something in the food. They didn't yet say germs, but they began to say contamination, corruption, decay. Books were written, letters exchanged, lectures given. In France, apothecaries began experimenting with food preservation. In Italy, physicians documented symptoms with precision. In England, scientists heated liquids to see if spoilage slowed. And slowly, very slowly, patterns began to emerge. Boiled water was safer. Cooked meat made fewer people sick. Clean vessels mattered. Wood rotted faster than clay. Some herbs helped preserve, others hastened spoilage. But for most people, this was still beyond reach. Scientific knowledge moved slower than famine, slower than rot. A butcher in York in 1725 didn't read medical journals. A fish seller in Naples didn't attend lectures in Florence. A baker in Krakow didn't debate microscopic theory. They did what their parents had done and hoped for, the best. Still, the change came, bit by bit. Cities invested more in sanitation. Sewers were dug, drainage improved, waste was carted away. Markets were rebuilt with stone floors, tiled walls, ventilated ceilings. By the mid-1800s, refrigeration began to arrive, first with ice blocks, then with compressed gas. It changed everything. Suddenly, food could last, could be stored, could be inspected before sale. And in 1861, a French chemist named Louis Pasteur confirmed what many had begun to suspect. Spoilage wasn't caused by bad air or moral failure. It was caused by living organisms, tiny ones, invisible ones, bacteria. And with that discovery, germ theory, the modern age of food safety began. It wasn't immediate. It didn't reach every village, every stall, every cottage kitchen, but it opened the door. And from there came health codes, expiration dates, sterilization, pasteurization, canning, and finally, the understanding that foodborne illness wasn't fate. It was preventable, but as we look back, it's easy to feel a kind of arrogance, to pity the past, to scoff at the ignorance, to wonder how people could eat meat crawling with flies, cheese coated in mold, bread baked with infested flour, but that pity is misplaced, because those people, market women, butchers, bakers, cooks, were survivors. They made decisions with what little they had. They passed down lessons in absence of books. They tasted, smelled, listened, watched. They noticed patterns, adjusted methods, warned others, and in many ways they laid the groundwork for what would become food science. So the next time you toss out milk one day past its date, or sniff at a bruised apple with suspicion, remember, you have the luxury of caution because they did not. You have the choice to avoid spoilage because they did not. And maybe, just maybe, that blackened carrot or soft tomato in your fridge isn't the end of the world. It's a reminder that safety is a privilege built on centuries of risk, and that every bite we take without fear is a gift they never had. In our world, food lasts. We wrap it, freeze it, refrigerate it, stamp it with dates. We eat strawberries in winter, fish flown across oceans, soup stored for months. But in the medieval world, time was the enemy of food. Every hour after slaughter, after harvest, after catch, brought spoilage, and without preservation, food meant danger. So people fought back, with fire, with salt, with smoke, with cleverness, passed down through the centuries. One salted fish, one dried fig, one smoked ham at a time. Let's start with salt. It may seem humble now. A seasoning, a sprinkle. But in the Middle Ages, salt was precious, valued not just for flavor, but for survival. Salt kept food from rotting. It pulled water from meat. It slowed the growth of bacteria long before anyone knew what bacteria were. And it was portable, meaning preserved food could travel. This made salt political, strategic, powerful. Salt was taxed, guarded, controlled. In France, the gabelle, a tax on salt, was so hated it helped spark the French Revolution centuries later. In medieval Italy, cities fought wars over salt pans. In England, kings controlled the rights to salt springs. In Germany, the city of Lüneburg grew rich from its underground salt, and for the poor. Salt was rationed, sometimes mixed with sand to stretch it, sometimes watered down before sale, sometimes priced so high that families could only afford a handful each month. But even a handful could preserve meat for days, which brings us to meat and the endless fight to keep it edible. Fresh meat had a short life, hours in summer, a day, maybe two in winter, so butchers and household cooks relied on salt and smoke. They'd pack pork in barrels, rub beef with thick layers of salt, hang it in cellars or smokehouses, small dark chambers where wood smoke blackened everything it touched. Smoke didn't just dry the meat, it flavored it, toughened it, and gave it a kind of second life. Ham became a winter staple not because it was delicious, but because it survived. Hard, dry, often stringy, but safe. In monasteries, preservation was an art. Monks smoked fish and eels. They salted hams and tongues. They dried fruit, pickled vegetables. They recorded it all, line by line, in thick leather books. Because for them, food was not just nourishment. It was order, stability, a way to feed the poor in times of famine, a way to trade, to barter, to survive. And for soldiers? Preserved food meant movement. Salted meat marched with armies. Hardtack, flour, water and salt baked into stone hard. Biscuits became a soldier's bread. It lasted for months, years even. You had to soak it in ale to eat it. And sometimes you'd find worms in the center, but it kept you alive. Then there was drying. Peas and lentils, dried on rooftops, stored in sacks. Fruit, sliced and hung near fires. Grain, winnowed, stored in bins, protected from moisture, like treasure. And honey. Honey was more than sweetness. It was preservation. Meat could be packed in honey. So could fruit, nuts, even flowers. It sealed the air out, kept spoilage at bay. And when the food was eaten, the honey was too. Now flavored, darkened, rich. Pickling came next. Cabbage in brine, onions in vinegar, eggs in sour ale. Acid slowed rot. And in winter, when greens vanished, pickles saved lives. Some preservation was accidental cheese, born of spoiled milk. Yogurt, a mistake that turned to tradition. Wine, grapes that fermented in barrels left too long in the sun. And once people tasted these accidents, they tried to replicate them, refine them, rely on them. Preservation became survival, but also culture. Different regions developed different methods. In the hot south, drying and salting. In the cool north, smoking, cellaring, pickling. In the mountains, fermentation and ice. But no method was perfect. Preserved food could go wrong. Salted meat could still rot. Dried peas could grow mold. Pickles could turn cloudy or explode. Hardtack could break teeth. Honey could ferment, and when it failed, people got sick. And when it succeeded, people lived. But it was always a gamble, and so the kitchen, the cellar, the pantry became sites of quiet science, not with microscopes or formulas, but with hands, with taste, with time. Because medieval people couldn't stop time, but they could slow it down. Just long enough to make it through winter, or through siege, or through the long weeks between market days. Still, one question remains. If food could be preserved, who got to eat it? Was it the laborer, the merchant, the monk, or was preserved? Food, like so much else, a privilege of class, that's what we'll explore next. In theory, preserved food was for everyone. Salted pork, dried peas, smoked fish. These were necessities. Winter didn't ask how much you earned. Mold didn't care what your title was. Decay came for all, but in practice, preservation favored the powerful. Let's begin at the top. Nobles had larders, not just pantries, but entire rooms built for food storage. Thick stone walls, cool earth floors, slatted windows to let in the air, but not the sun. Hooks hung. From beams for cured meats. Barrels of pickled herring lined the walls. Cheeses aged in corners. Jars of honey and spice sat sealed in wax, and there were servants to mind it all. Scullions who stirred vinegar barrels, cooks who rotated dried herbs, stewards who marked spoilage and called for replacements. It wasn't perfect, even royal. Courts suffered spoilage, but it was planned. Managed monasteries were similar. Though bound by poverty, monks were careful custodians of food. Their records, preserved in parchment and memory, show incredible attention to cycles, salting schedules, pickling volumes, aging times. Their goal wasn't gluttony, it was continuity. A monastery had to feed not just monks, but the poor. Travelers, orphans, refugees in times of plague or war. So preservation wasn't luxury, it was duty, and that duty required knowledge. Monks shared methods across borders, recipes for vinegar pickled eggs, smoking instructions for eels, brining ratios for cabbage, fermentation times for beer and cheese. Some even wrote full treatises on food care. But outside the abbey and manor, preservation got harder. For peasants, every method required a price. Salt was taxed. Firewood for smoking was limited. Clean storage space was rare. Time, the most precious commodity, was always in short supply. Preserving food meant not working the fields that day. It meant risking the loss of an entire week's harvest if the brine turned cloudy or the smokehouse caught fire. And yet, they did it anyway, in small ways. Dried apples on rafters, smoked sausages over hearths, jars of pickled beets buried under floors, wheels of hard cheese set atop hay in cool corners. The goal was never abundance, just enough. Enough to get through. Lent, through February, through the next child's fever, through the next tax. For the urban poor, preservation was even more elusive. A city dweller might rent a single room, no cellar, no chimney, no space. They relied on markets, on day-to-day purchases, on street food, on scraps. And scraps didn't preserve well. So the divide widened. The preserved foods of the poor were often the cast-offs of the rich. Bone ends, rind edges, brine-soaked leavings, and in times of famine, preserved foods became currency, a dried. Sausage might trade for labor. A sack of salted cod could secure an alliance. A barrel of smoked herring might mean the difference between survival and starvation. Even politics got involved. Kings stockpiled salted meat for war. Towns hoarded grain in secret cellars. Lords demanded preserved goods as part of rents and tithes. Preservation was power, not just because it kept food from spoiling, but because it gave those who controlled it the ability to shape who ate and who didn't. Still, not all was unequal. Fairs and festivals brought temporary abundance. Monasteries distributed. Pickled fish on holy days. Weddings called for shared feasts with smoked ham and dried fruit. And every now and then a peasant might cure a ham so perfectly it would hang uneaten for months, a symbol of luck, pride, and restraint. But these were moments, not norms. For most, preserved food was rationed carefully, guarded closely, and eaten only when fresh food failed. And that fear of failure, of the salted pork gone green, the cheese turned, the pickles popped, never quite left the medieval mind. Even today, traces remain. Our love of expiration dates, our suspicion of smells, our cautious tasting of leftovers. They echo old fears, ones built not in science labs but in smoky kitchens, damp cellars, and famine-thinned winters. But even with all our modern knowledge, why does preserved food still carry a stigma? Why do we prefer fresh, even when fresh isn't safer or better? That's what we'll explore next. You might have noticed something strange. We live in a time of abundance. Refrigeration, packaging, sealed, dated, inspected food from around the globe, and yet preserved food still makes many people uneasy. Canned meat, pickled eggs, hardtack-style biscuits, salted fish, aged cheese with rind. We wrinkle our noses, assume it's old, or strange, or unclean. Why? The answer lies in part with the people we've just spent time with. Medieval peasants, monks, butchers, cooks and traders. Their fears became habits. Their habits became norms. Their norms became buried, but never erased. Preserved food in their world was never a luxury. It was a last resort, a fallback, a hedge against hunger, and that association stuck. In the medieval world, fresh meant wealth, abundance, control. If you could slaughter an animal and eat it that day, you were well off. If your bread came from today's flour, you had access. If your fruits were in season, unblemished, straight from the tree, you had servants perhaps, land, security. Preserved food was for survival, for when the hunt failed, when the fields froze, when the ships didn't arrive. So over time a cultural equation formed. Fresh, Duskars good. Preserved defined poor, even though this wasn't always true. Some preserved foods were better than fresh. Hard cheese kept longer, but also carried more fat and nutrients. Salted fish was safer than river-caught trout in summer. Pickled onions prevented scurvy when greens were scarce. Fermented cabbage, what we now call sauerkraut, helped restore gut health long before anyone spoke the word probiotic. But the bias held. Even today, many people hesitate over preserved goods unless they're rebranded as gourmet. Aged prosciutto, fermented kimchi, artisanal pickles, barrel-aged vinegar. We admire them only when they're dressed up. We forget the cellar, the brine barrel, the smokehouse behind the cottage. We forget the work, the risk, the knowledge. Because preserving food wasn't simple. It wasn't just add salt. It was timing, temperature, observation, memory. Too much salt and the meat turned to stone. Too little and it bloated with bacteria. Too much smoke and the flavor soured. Too little and it rotted from the inside out. And still, they tried. Because to preserve food was to preserve hope. A meal in April when nothing grew. A feast in December when snow covered the fields. A stew in the lean weeks before harvest. Preserved food meant continuity, and continuity was life. Even during plague years, wars, droughts, preserved food offered a thread, something to hold on to. So the next time you open a can of beans, or unwrap a wedge of cheese, or reach for something preserved, maybe pause. Don't wrinkle your nose. Think instead of the people who made preservation possible. The woman who stirred the pickling pot in the corner of her hut. The monk who tracked the days it took beef to cure. The father who salted fish so his family could eat through winter. And wonder, what else have we forgotten? Because it was ordinary. Because it was just food. Just storage. Just a way to make it through another week. If you close your eyes and think of a medieval meal, you might picture a feast, a table heavy with meats, goblets of wine, firelight, roasted birds with apples in their beaks. But for most people, nearly everyone in fact, food was not a feast. It was a pot, simmering, constant, rarely emptied, rarely cleaned, just refilled. That pot was pottage. A thick stew made from whatever could be found, grains, legumes, scraps of meat, onions, turnips, herbs, stale bread, and water. No recipe, no end. Pottage wasn't just a meal, it was a way of life. In the cottage of a medieval peasant, the hearth was the heart. And above the hearth a pot, blackened with soot, often iron, sometimes bronze, hung from a hook or rested on stones, and in that pot a daily ritual. Each morning someone would tend it, stir it, taste it, add to it, grind a handful of barley, toss in yesterday's bones, add a leek, a pinch of salt, a crust of bread. By evening it was thick again. Some households called it perpetual, stew. Others simply the pot. In larger homes or communal settings, it might simmer for weeks. Not boiling, not quite, but always warm, always ready. And if it spoiled, they boiled it harder, because nothing was wasted, not even pottage gone. Sour. A stronger fire, a longer boil, and back to the table it went. Why pottage? Because it made sense. In a world where grain was currency, where meat was scarce, where kitchens were smoky and small, pottage was practical. It stretched food, softened hard bread, fed many from little, turned scraps into sustenance. It was filling, hot, easy to make, hard to ruin, and it could be endlessly personalized. In spring, nettles, young garlic, eggs. In summer, beans, peas, herbs, river fish. In autumn, squash, onions, cured pork. In winter, dried lentils, stale bread, and maybe, just maybe, a bone from a holiday roast. Each region had its variations. In England, barley and leeks. In France, cabbage and beans. In Scandinavia, root vegetables and salted herring. In Isimo, Italy, chickpeas, garlic, olive oil, and if you were lucky, the poor added what they could. The rich added saffron, spices, even dried fruit. But the base was always the same, grains and water thickened by time, and over time, the pot gained more than flavor. It gained meaning. A pot of pottage was a symbol of home, of survival, of patience. It bubbled while babies were born, while shoes were mended, while prayers were said. It fed the hungry after funerals, after storms, after taxes were paid. And still, each time someone stirred it, they asked, "What can we add? What can we spare?" Because pottage wasn't just food, it was an economy of the household. You saved a chicken bone not for the dog, but for the pot. You dried herbs not to impress, but to flavor the bland weeks. You cut the meat small so it vanished in the bay, boil giving more than it gave, and for those who had nothing at all, there was still pottage, thinned out perhaps, but shared. In some towns, communal pots fed the sick. In monasteries, they fed pilgrims. In parishes, they fed the poor. Even prisons had pottage, and while some might mock it, as bland, as repetitive, as peasant food, there was power in that pot, because it held memories, it held routine, it held warmth when the fire was low and the wind howled outside. But what happened when the pot ran dry? When famine struck, when harvests failed, when the pottage held only water and memories and hunger? That's where we go next. It's easy to romanticize the pottage pot, to picture it bubbling away in a quiet cottage, to imagine it as a symbol of warmth, family, and humble resilience. But sometimes the pot was empty, and when the pot was empty, there was no safety net, no snacks, no alternatives, no emergency supplies tucked away, because if the pot ran dry, it meant the family had nothing, not even scraps, and that was more common than you'd think. Let's step back. In a good year, a truly good year, a family might harvest enough to get through winter. Dry enough beans, smoke enough meat, store enough grain. But good years were rare. One storm, one drought, one plague, and everything changed. When crops failed, the pot emptied fast. First went the meat, then the fat, then the barley and oats. Soon people were boiling cabbage leaves and pebbles for flavor. You might laugh, but stone soup was real. Not to eat the stone, but to hold the illusion. A reason to gather, a reason to stir. A way to signal, yes, something's coming, but often nothing came. In these times, pottage was thinned into broth, broth into water, water into silence, and with each passing day, the family's health faded. Because pottage wasn't just symbolic, it was nutritional. It carried protein, fat, calories, all in one bowl. Without it, children didn't grow. Mothers stopped producing milk. Fathers collapsed in the fields. And even if you had a little left, how do you stretch it? You use more water. You add more. Herbs, you cut everything smaller. A single onion spread across 5 bowls. A handful of lentils mashed into the illusion of more. Bread crusts soaked, melted, vanished. And when even that failed, you got creative medieval people boiled everything. Grass, dandelions, tree bark, leather scraps, moss, old cloth. And in the pot it all dissolved into something almost edible. Not good, not safe, but something. Of course, it wasn't always famine. That drained the pot. Sometimes it was war. Armies passed through villages and took everything, food, animals, even the pots themselves. Sometimes it was plague. Families too sick to cook. Mothers too weak to stir. Fathers buried outside while children sat around a cold hearth. Sometimes it was taxation. The Lord's men came, took the best grains, demanded meat for the manna, left behind nothing but turnips and grief. And so the pottage pot became a quiet measure of a household's fortune, full and rich. They'd had a good harvest, or good luck, thin and sour. Trouble had visited, empty and blackened. They'd lost the fight. But people endured. They scraped the sides, soaked the pot overnight to loosen the crust, drank the water it soaked in, scraped again, because sometimes the only thing left and was the memory of a meal. Still, when the famine lifted, and it always did eventually, the pot returned to life. Grains trickled back into sacks. Vegetables reappeared at market. A hen laid again. A neighbor shared a rabbit. Someone traded for a carrot, a bone, a bit of fat. And the fire was lit. The pot scrubbed, the water boiled, and the stirring began again, but this time a little more. Carefully, a little more slowly, as if each addition, each bean, each pinch of salt was an offering. A prayer, a promise not to forget the emptiness. Still, even in abundance, why did pottage remain so central? Why not abandon it for new dishes, new methods, new symbols of better times? Why did the pot continue to bubble, as even when the cupboards were full? We'll answer that next. The famine passed. The rains came, or the plague ebbed, or the war moved on, and slowly life crept back into the cottage, into the village, into the pot. It would have been easy to change things then, to leave behind the thick, endless stew, to cook something new, and some did. In the courts of kings, roasted meats and pies replaced soup. In merchant kitchens, layered dishes emerged. Spices flowed from the east. In abbeys and manors, meals became more structured. Courses appeared, but the pottage pot remained. Not because people forgot how to cook other things, but because they remembered how to survive. The pot was a comfort, a habit, a ritual. Even when the cupboards were stocked, the pot still simmered, on the back of the hearth, quietly, all day, every day, because pottage wasn't just about hunger. It was about rhythm. Wake. Stoke the fire, stir the pot. Midday, add scraps, stir again. Evening, ladle it out. Clean the bowls, let it rest. Tomorrow, repeat. The act itself brought order, stability. In a world ruled by weather, lords, and fate, the pot was yours. You chose what went in. You decided how long it boiled. You tasted, adjusted, nourished. It connected people. Everyone ate it, babies and elders, farmers and friars. No one was too proud for pottage. Even the rich remembered it from childhood, from illness, from Lent. It was democratic food, and more than that, it was efficient. In the Middle Ages, time was scarce. Daylight was short, work was constant, and firewood was precious. A single pot, on a single fire. That was ideal. Add to that the lack of utensils, the shared bowl, the bread used as spoon or sponge, and you see how pottage wasn't just food. It was architecture. Meals were designed around it, tables arranged for it, customs built on it. In some villages, the first bowl went to the eldest. In others, it went to the guest. In hard times, it was divided equally. No favoritism, no excess. It taught fairness. Even today, echoes remain in Scotland, broths thick with barley. In France, pot au feu. In West Africa, gumbo-like stews with okra and rice. In Asia, congee, rice porridge stirred all day. All of them variations on the pottage principle. All of them born of need, shaped by scarcity, sustained by care. You'll find versions of it on every continent, in refugee camps, in monasteries, in quiet homes where someone still stirs with the same wooden spoon. Because no matter how far we come, how sleek our kitchens, how smart our fridges, we carry the memory of the pot. The knowledge that a single vessel, a single fire, a single ladle of something warm can keep people alive, can keep them together. So the next time you eat something simple, a soup, a stew, a bowl of leftovers heated again, maybe you're not being lazy. Maybe you're honoring the thousands who stirred before you, the mothers who stretched the last handful of oats, the fathers who traded a day's labor for a carrot, the children who learned without knowing how to feed a future, because pottage wasn't about flavor. It was about endurance, and perhaps in the quiet moments when your own kitchen goes still, you'll hear it, that slow, soft bubble, that patient boil, that sound of history whispering from the bottom of the pot. Close your eyes, imagine a medieval city just after sunrise, narrow alleys still damp with dew, smoke beginning to curl from chimneys. Somewhere, a church bell rings, and then you hear it, squealing, high-pitched, panicked, relentless. It's not rats, not children, it's pigs, hundreds of them, snorting, slipping through the mud, dragged in carts, herded through side streets, their hooves clatter on stone, their eyes wide, their smell overwhelming. This was the sound of breakfast being prepared. Because, in the medieval world, meat didn't arrive wrapped and chilled, it arrived screaming. Especially pigs, they were cheap to raise, hard to anything, grew fast, provided fat, meat, organs, and even bristles for brushes. They were the go-to livestock for both peasants and butchers, and in towns and cities across Europe, pigs came to market every day. Butchering didn't happen out of sight. There were no backrooms, no sanitization, no health inspectors. It happened in public, often right there in the street. Slaughtermen stood barefoot in aprons soaked to the hem, knives glinting, wooden blocks cracked with years of use, barrels waiting for blood. Children watched, dogs circled, and the pigs, they knew. Some screamed until the last second. Others fell silent, wide-eyed, trembling. There were no painkillers, no laws against cruelty, just speed, a cut to the throat, a bucket for the blood, a quick scalding to remove hair. Then the work began. Butchery wasn't clean. Entrails spilled onto cobblestones. Bones snapped. Rats emerged to steal scraps. Guts slid into gutters. Flies arrived within minutes. By mid-morning the air thickened, iron-rich and hot, and by afternoon the market reeked of offal, of sweat, of death. You might wonder, why not clean it up? Some cities tried. London passed ordinances in the 13th and 14th centuries, banning open-air butchery in certain areas. Paris too attempted to move slaughterhouses to the city's edge, but enforcement was spotty. Butchers were powerful. They formed guilds, paid taxes, fed the city, employed workers, and they didn't want to move. So the pigs stayed. The knives stayed. The stench stayed, and so did the danger. Because where there's raw meat and poor sanitation, there's sickness. Meat wasn't inspected. Pigs weren't quarantined. Diseases passed freely, from animal to man, from stall to customer. The worst? Plague meat. In times of disease, especially during outbreaks of bubonic plague, meat. Markets became death traps. Sick pigs showed no symptoms until slaughter. Sick butchers came to work anyway. Sick meat, once sold, passed the sickness on. Of course, people didn't know about bacteria or viruses, but they saw the pattern, so rumors began. That pork carried the plague, that butchers were cursed, that markets were haunted by disease. Some towns responded by banning meat sales entirely during outbreaks. Others simply moved the markets outside the walls. But the crowds followed. The hunger stayed and the pigs kept coming. You might think this was only in cities, but no. Even small towns had central butchery sites, often near rivers for washing. The waste flowed into the water. The same water people drank from, washed clothes in, baptized their children in, and so illness spread quietly, predictably, and yet meat kept selling. Because for many, pork was the only meat they could afford, and fresh pork, even with risk, was a luxury. Better than spoiled salt beef, better than dried fish, better than fasting. Still, not all pork was sold fresh. Some was preserved, salted, smoked, dried. But that too had its dangers, especially if the pig was sick before slaughter, especially if shortcuts were taken, especially if the brine turned sour. And in crowded cities, shortcuts were common, so people learned to look carefully, to sniff the fat, to press the meat, to ask the butcher questions, not because they trusted him, but because they had no choice. But what happened when trust broke down? When a butcher knowingly sold plague meat, when a town tried to regulate him and the guild pushed back? What happened when meat became political? That's where we go next. The blood in the streets wasn't just literal, it was economic, political, and sometimes fatal. By the 13th century, meat markets in medieval Europe weren't just noisy corners of trade, they were battlegrounds. And the butchers, they weren't just workers, they were power brokers. In nearly every major city, the butchers' guild was one of the richest, loudest, and most deeply entrenched institutions. They had money, they had connections. They fed the population, after all. And they knew it. Guilds controlled who could sell meat, who could slaughter, who could cut, pack, salt, smoke, and display. They set prices, determined quality, regulated apprenticeships, and when towns tried to regulate hygiene or move slaughterhouses out of the public eye, guilds often pushed back, hard. You see, butchery wasn't just a trade, it was a closed system. To become a master butcher, you needed years of training, an exam, and in many cases, a family connection. And once in, you protected your territory. The guild ensured that complaints against its members were handled quietly, that fines were paid internally, that city officials were advised on which rules could be ignored. Meanwhile, the public grew wary. They had good reason. Scandals surfaced, of rotted meat disguised with herbs, of pork sold from pigs who'd died of disease, of spoiled fat rendered into lard and sold to the poor. In London, there were riots in Cheapside over rancid meat. In Rouen, France, a butcher was nearly killed by a mob after a child died from tainted pork. In Cologne, townspeople petitioned for a ban on pig slaughter within city walls after a wave of fevers spread near the meat market. The link between bad meat and bad health was never fully understood, but deeply felt. And so, in many places, people began to seek alternatives. Fishmongers saw more business. Cheesemongers grew in importance. Even vegetarians, a rarity in that age, gained quiet respect, particularly among certain religious communities who viewed abstention from meat as both a spiritual and sanitary virtue. But meat remained, because hunger was louder than fear, and pork especially was too convenient to ignore. The entire animal could be used, nothing wasted. The blood went into sausages, the fat into candles and cooking grease, the hooves boiled for jelly, the intestines used for casings, the meat preserved, salted, smoked, fried, or boiled. And so, the cycle continued. Guilds protected their own. City councils made half-hearted attempts at reform. Markets buzzed with activity regardless of the smell, and the poor kept buying what they could afford, even if it came with consequences. Still, some cities managed real change. In Florence, the Arte dei Becai, the Butchers' Guild, was eventually forced to relocate slaughter to the city, outskirts near the Arno River. In London, butchering within certain precincts was outlawed during summer months, when spoilage was highest. In Ghent, meat stalls were centralized in covered halls, with drainage systems carved into the stone floor. These measures weren't always followed, but they marked a shift, a slow recognition that blood in the street led to blood in the lungs. And that public health mattered, even if no one used those exact words. But perhaps the biggest shift came not from within cities, but from the countryside. As rural roads improved and trade expanded, more towns began importing meat from outside. Farmers, slaughtered in fields, transported salted or smoked pork into town, sold directly to citizens or to smaller independent butchers who weren't part of guilds. It was slower, less efficient, often more expensive, but it was cleaner, and some city folk were willing to pay. Of course, the guilds fought back. They lobbied, they taxed, they barred access to prime market spaces, but the cracks had formed. The idea that meat didn't have to be butchered in full view, beside gutters, near sewage in the heat of midday, was taking hold. And once ideas like that take root, they don't vanish. But what finally broke the system? What brought true reform to the meat markets? Was it law, science, another outbreak of plague, or something simpler, like the arrival of a cold box? That's what we'll explore next. The pigs kept squealing, the knives kept swinging, the blood kept running down the cobbles. But behind closed doors, in study halls, in courtrooms, in taverns where educated men talked, something was beginning to shift. People were asking questions, not just why the meat smelled, but how in the 17th and 18th centuries Europe saw a wave of new ideas and about the body, about disease, about cleanliness. The Enlightenment brought microscopes, observations, theories, and eventually answers. Spoiled meat didn't smell because it was cursed or corrupted by air. It smelled because of bacteria, rot, putrefaction, tiny living things invisible to the eye that spread sickness. By the early 1800s, these ideas gained traction. Doctors began connecting the dots between meat markets and illness. Writers described butchery districts as pools of infection. Some priests even declared open-air slaughter a moral offense, not just against animals, but against the health of man. Cities took note. Reforms that had once been suggestions became requirements. Covered meat halls replaced alleyway stalls. Drains were installed. Waste was collected, at least more often. Pigs were banned from wandering freely in towns. In 1850s London, the infamous Smithfield Market, long known for its horror and filth, underwent reconstruction. Iron, glass, and stone replaced blood-soaked wood. But reform wasn't just physical. It was also technological. The real breakthrough, cold ice blocks imported from Norway or cut from northern lakes, began to appear in wealthier butcher shops. Then came insulated boxes. Then, slowly, miraculously, refrigeration. By the late 19th century, mechanical refrigeration arrived in Europe. Meat no longer needed to be butchered and sold within hours. It could be chilled, stored, inspected, and for the first time in history, people could buy meat that was fresh and safe, not just newly dead. Still, not everyone trusted it. Some thought cold meat lacked strength. Others feared the machines. Many still preferred to see the animal, see the slaughter, know it was real. But the shift had begun. Refrigeration gave birth to the butcher's counter, glass windows, clean uniforms, stainless steel. No more gutters, no more pigs crying at dawn, no more entrails slapping cobblestones. Of course, these changes didn't happen overnight, Cuntiat, or everywhere. In poorer districts, open-air butchery lingered. In rural villages, tradition held firm. And in some places it does to this day. But the balance tipped, and in tipping the meaning of meat changed. Once a dangerous gamble, meat became a symbol of cleanliness, order, progress. The guilds lost their monopoly. Government took over inspections. Health codes emerged, and with them the modern butcher, less craftsman, more hygienist. Still, the memory remained. Even now we flinch at the smell of pork too long in the fridge. We hesitate over meat that's too red or too pale or not quite cold. We're told to cook it thoroughly, to never trust the surface, to treat raw flesh with suspicion. And maybe deep down it's not just about bacteria. Maybe it's the echo of blood in the street, of hooves on stone, of a pig tied to a post in a square filled with flies. Because while the icebox gave us safety, the memory of plague meat, of disease, of danger, never fully thawed. So the next time you open your fridge, see that clean package of pork or beef or lamb. Take a moment. Think of the butcher in the alley, the squeal at dawn, the woman washing, entrails in the river, the child buying meat with his last coin, and be grateful, not just for safety, but for the slow, painful, messy path that led us here, from gutter to icebox, from plague to preservation. Let's start not in the fields, but behind high walls. Stone, walls, ivy-covered, echoing with quiet chants. A place where time moved slowly, bells marked the hours, and silence wasn't just a virtue, it was a rule. This was the medieval monastery. And inside those walls, beyond the gardens and cloisters, there was another kind of power, not just the power of prayer or script or law, but the power of food. Because monasteries, more than almost any institution in the medieval world, decided what people ate, and when and how, not just for monks, but for the townsfolk, the poor, the sick, the travelers, and their rules were strict. Let's begin with the monks themselves. In theory, monastic life was about simplicity. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed across much of Europe, laid it out clearly: no meat of four-footed animals, 2 meals per day, moderation in all things. Breakfast was rare. Lunch around midday might include bread, vegetables, maybe a little fish. Supper was lighter, sometimes just a piece of bread dipped in wine. Meat was reserved for the sick. For feast days, for exceptions carefully noted in parchment ledgers, but reality was more complicated because monasteries were not just places of prayer. They were landlords. They owned fields, mills, vineyards, breweries. They collected rents, often in the form of food. They stored grain, managed cattle, brewed, cured meat. And all that food had to go somewhere, so loopholes appeared. For example, meat was banned, but birds, not quite four-footed. Monks across Europe became experts in raising ducks, geese, and pigeons. Fish, too, was considered fair game, especially freshwater fish like carp or eels. Some monasteries even built elaborate ponds, stocked them, bred fish to the point of industry. Then came the kitchen clauses, a separate room. The misericorde was set up for those monks who were too weak to keep the dietary rule. Here meat was allowed, quietly, regularly, sometimes daily, and before long the misericorde became the preferred dining hall. Because monks are people, and people get hungry, especially when they're working, copying texts, tending gardens, managing tenants, treating the ill, studying by candlelight. Still, the rules stayed, and with them a strange contradiction. Monks who preached simplicity and self-denial often had the most structured, well-stocked diets in Europe. They baked their own bread, usually from refined flour. They made cheese, sometimes dozens, of varieties. They brewed beer, safer than water, richer than ale. They raised bees for honey, grew herbs for both medicine and flavor, and they kept records. Monastic kitchens were run with precision. Inventories were taken, rations measured, waste tracked. The cellarer, the monk in charge of supplies, held enormous authority. He knew what was in the storerooms, what could be spared, what must be saved for Lent, what could be given or withheld. And with that knowledge came power, because monasteries weren't just feeding themselves, they fed the community. On holy days, alms were distributed: bread, fish, sometimes dried, fruit. Pilgrims were offered meals and shelter. The sick received broths and stews, and in times of famine, the monastery was often the last line of defense. They opened their granaries, distributed salted meat, fed the hungry at the gate, but not always equally. Sometimes food came with conditions, sometimes with preference: a favor owed, a debt repaid, a family remembered. And that brings us to the quiet bribes. Because while monks were forbidden to own private property, some still keep managed. Small gifts, a better cut of cheese, an extra loaf of bread, a flask of wine set aside during Lent. Not always out of greed, sometimes out of mercy, sometimes to help a friend, a sister, a nearby tenant, who had nothing left. Still, it bent the rules, and when the rules bend too far, that's where reform begins. Because not everyone agreed with the monks' control over food, or with how they used it. So how did monastic kitchens become battlegrounds of morality? And what happened when monks feasted while peasants starved? That's what we'll explore next. The monastery was built on restraint, restraint of words, of desire, of indulgence. But food lived in a strange in-between, because monks didn't speak during meals, but they tasted, and they didn't feast, but they ate well. In many abbeys, the silence of the refectory, the dining hall, was broken only by the voice of one monk, reading scripture aloud as others dipped bread into thick stew or sipped warmed beer. No conversation, no noise, just chewing, listening, praying. It was, in theory, a holy act. But the food, it could be spectacular. Some monastic kitchens rivaled noble households. They had dedicated bakers, brewers, gardeners, and butchers. They used imported spices, cinnamon, pepper, cloves. They traded for salt, oil, almonds, and dried fruit. They built tiered ovens for bread, grew saffron and fennel in cloistered beds, and the meals followed the liturgical calendar with near military precision. Mondays might mean legumes. Fridays, fish, never meat. Sundays, richer stews, eggs, sweetened bread. Lent, austere broths and dry loaves. But those fasts, they had workarounds. Eggs were prohibited during Lent, so monks boiled them, mashed them, mixed them with herbs and called it white dish. Milk was frowned upon, so they diluted it, cooked it, and blessed it for the sick. Rules were interpreted with creativity, because even the most devout understood hunger was not holy. Too much hunger led to weakness. Too much weakness led to failure. And failure, spiritual, physical, communal, was dangerous. So they ate. And in times of plenty, they ate very well. Records from English monasteries show daily rations that would shock the modern reader. A full pound of bread per monk, several pints of ale, 2 or more hot dishes, often including meat or fish cheese, fruit, sometimes even pastries. And this in an age when peasants survived on scraps and pottage. The contrast grew more visible as the centuries passed. Peasants watched carts of food pass through the monastery gates. They heard rumors or truths of smoked hams, aged cheese, pickled eggs, barrels of wine. And they questioned not just the justice, but the holiness. Because wasn't this a place of simplicity? Wasn't this bread meant to be broken, not hoarded? And so voices rose. Reformers, within and outside the church, began criticizing monastic excess. In England, during the 12th and 13th centuries, new orders like the Cistercians emerged. They rejected the comforts of Benedictine life, built simpler monasteries, ate rougher meals, returned to hard labor. Their diet? Sparse, mostly beans, coarse bread, watered wine, no meat, no sweetmeats, no indulgence. They slept on straw, woke before dawn, worked in silence, and for a time people admired them, trusted them, turned to them. But history repeats. The Cistercians grew, gained land, wealth, influence, and with that came food, and with food came negotiation. And once again, the simple stew became a delicate broth, because no matter the order, Benedictine, Cistercian, Augustinian, food was always a mirror. It reflected the monastery's strength, its discipline, its compassion, or lack of. At and outside the walls, resentment brewed, especially in famine years, especially when monks were seen eating fish while townsfolk died in the street, especially when the church ordered fasting, but allowed fish, eels, almond milk, and cakes, without butter. To the poor, this wasn't humility, it was hypocrisy. And that anger simmered into gossip, into protest, into revolt. In the 14th and 15th centuries, as plagues swept through Europe, many blamed monasteries, not for causing illness, but for hoarding food, failing to help, living in comfort while others died. Some monasteries responded by opening their doors, distributing grain, feeding the sick. Others closed their gates, locked their larders, protected what they had, and the memory stuck. Even today, the idea of a monk with a full belly while peasants starved still lingers. It isn't the whole truth, but it was true often enough to leave a scar. So how did that system finally break? What happened when the church lost its grip on the table, and who sat around it? That's what we'll explore next. By the late Middle Ages, the monastery's control over food, over kitchens, fields, and grain stores had lasted for centuries. But power built on silence, privilege, and selective generosity rarely lasts forever. The cracks began small. A new kind of hunger emerged, not just for food, but for reform, for justice, for transparency, for something more honest than a loaf of bread handed out with a sermon. By the 15th century, the world was shifting. Towns were growing, merchants were rising. Printing presses were whispering new ideas, and everywhere people were watching the monasteries and asking questions. Why does a monk eat better than a mason? Why does the abbey feast while the village fasts? Why does God's bread taste sweeter behind stone walls? Some monks, to their credit, asked the same. Inside abbeys, reformers wrote letters, debated, fasted for real, opened their storerooms, chose harder paths, but the tide was rising. In England, Henry VIII's break from the church was political, but its effects were deeply physical. The dissolution of the monasteries, beginning in 1536, swept through the country like a storm. Monasteries closed, libraries burned, land seized, granaries emptied, monks were turned out, pensions paid, silence broken, and with them, the vast kitchens fell silent. No more carefully tracked loaves, no more meat cellars and fish ponds, no more refectory readings. The food, once measured by saints and scribes, now belonged to nobles, to bureaucrats, to market forces. It was not a clean transition. Many poor families, once fed by monastic alms, found themselves adrift. The local abbey, for all its flaws, had been a safety net, and now gone. Some monasteries were converted to homes, others to barns or ruins. Their old kitchens used to cure tobacco. Their wine cellars emptied and sold, but the shift in food power was clear. The church no longer controlled the table. Over the next 2 centuries, control moved toward the state and the market. Food was sold, not distributed. Measured in coin, not charity. Charity itself became formalized. Almshouses, soup kitchens, parish relief. And in this new world, memory lingered. Not of prayers or chants or cloisters, but of meals, of silence broken only by chewing, of the cellarer with his key, of the ledger listing how many loaves for the sick, how much ale for feast days, how many eggs per monk per week. Those records, mundane, careful, boring, are some of the best windows we have into daily life. They tell us how people survived, how they rationed, how they fed not just themselves but each other. And though the monasteries faded, their influence echoed in cookbooks, in preservation techniques, in the very idea of regulated communal food systems. Even now, hospital menus and boarding schools and prison rations follow rhythms the monasteries once laid out, because feeding people with fairness, purpose, and restraint is a hard thing to do, and the monks, for all their contradictions, tried, sometimes with grace, sometimes with greed, but always with food. So the next time you walk past a ruined abbey or hear chants in a distant church recording, think of the kitchen, the warmth of the hearth, the weight of the ledger, the silence of dinner broken only by the scrape of a spoon, and ask, what do we owe to the ones who fed quietly, faithfully, and imperfectly for centuries? No plates, no silver, no second helpings, just a wooden bowl, a rough spoon, and the same meal a day after day. This was the life of a medieval peasant. Forget what you've seen in films: hearty roasts, lavish spreads, mugs overflowing with... For the vast majority of Europe's population, food was not variety. It was repetition, and that repetition had a name. Legumes, peas, lentils, beans, broad beans, chickpeas, fava, dried, soaked, boiled, again and again. Why? Because they grew well, because they stored well, because they filled the stomach, and because they were cheap. The peasant diet was built for survival, not pleasure. It had to withstand long winters, scarce harvests, tax collectors, sick animals, rain that wouldn't stop or wouldn't come. So, a typical day might begin with bread, if there was any. Coarse, dark, made from rye or barley or a mixture of grains swept from the mill floor. Sometimes spread with lard, more often eaten dry, soaked in water, ale, or pottage to soften. Lunch, if the word even applied, was more bread, a spoon of peas, an onion, a chunk of cheese, if luck was smiling. Dinner, the main meal, was often a stew, not the rich aromatic kind with wine and herbs, but water, salt, and legumes boiled for hours, thickened with root vegetables. Maybe a bit of bacon fat left over from someone else's meal, no forks, just fingers, bread, and a spoon, if you had one. It wasn't bad. It wasn't good. It was there, filling, heavy, functional. In a good year, a family might supplement with fresh vegetables and cabbage, leeks, turnips, wild greens. In a great year, maybe fruit, apples, pears, berries picked from hedgerows. But protein, that was rare. Meat was reserved for Sundays, feast days, weddings, or funerals. A chicken slaughtered to honor a guest, a rabbit caught in a snare, a pig shared with 3 families, a bone boiled 3 times before being thrown to the dog. Eggs? Not often. Hens were more valuable for laying than eating. And if eggs were gathered, they were often sold for coin, not cracked for breakfast. Dairy sometimes, but milk spoiled fast. And cheese, especially hard cheese, was kept for winter or travel. Water, not always safe. Ale was more common, weak, cloudy, low in alcohol, brewed at home. It killed bacteria, gave energy, and kept the belly warm. And all of this, all of it, was dependent on land. Land you didn't own. Land you worked. Land that was taxed. Land that could be taken. And when it failed, when the harvest was poor or the weather turned, meals shrank. Bread disappeared first, then cheese, then stew turned to broth, then broth turned to water. And in those times, people turned to hunger foods: nettles, boiled bark, grass, grains scraped from barn floors, a dead crow if you were brave, a stolen root if you were desperate, and always legumes, boiled again, salted again, swallowed slowly. Because they were the last thing left. Still, tart, it wasn't all bleak. Families grew herbs in windowsills, brewed tisanes from flowers, shared stews with neighbors, sang while shelling beans, told stories while stirring pots. Food was not joyful, but it was central. And when something special came along, a honeycomb, a fish, a handful of nuts, it was celebrated quietly, given to a child, offered to the old, saved for the sick. So you see, the peasant's diet wasn't rich, but it was remembered because it fed the world. But how did that humble diet shape the health of the medieval poor? Were they sickly, as you might assume? Or did their simplicity offer unexpected strength? We'll explore that next. The food was bland, the meals were meager, the bowls were cracked, and yet the peasants lived. They worked fields from sunrise to sunset. They carried sacks, turned soil, chopped wood, drew water, tended animals, raised children, and they did. It all on a diet of smush. So how? How did they survive? The answer is stranger and sturdier than it seems. Because despite the monotony, the peasant diet wasn't nutritionally empty. It was heavy on legumes, yes, but legumes are protein. Peas and beans, when paired with grains like barley or rye, form a complete protein. Not steak, but not nothing. Add in wild greens, onions, garlic, leeks, and you get iron, fiber, vitamin C, antioxidants, even nettles, scorned today, are rich in calcium, potassium, and magnesium. The stew may have looked like sludge, but it sustained. And without sugar, without refined flours, without processed fats, peasant bodies were often lean, muscular, and enduring. They didn't suffer from diabetes or high cholesterol or heart disease as we know it. Instead, they battled other things: malnutrition during famine years, especially among children, rickets in areas with little sunlight or dairy, scurvy in winters without greens or fruit, parasites from contaminated water or food, dysentery, frequent and often fatal, and injuries. So many injuries because their strength didn't protect them from accident, infection, or childbirth. But day to day, for most of the year, they survived, worked hard, endured cold, rain, hunger, not because of meat or privilege, but because of plants, because of that same old pot, because of boiled beans and thick slices of barley bread. They walked miles, carried wood, pushed carts, fought wars on lentils. Still, this strength came with strain. The diet left little room for rest or repair. Wounds healed slowly, cold settled deep, and during famine, the crash was hard, because there was no reserve. Single bad year could undo a life, and so food became something else entirely. Not just sustenance, but memory, a rhythm, a tether. Peasants didn't just eat together as they survived together. Food was shared, carefully, politely, even when it hurt. A piece of bread passed to a neighbor, an onion split 3 ways, a secret stash of lentils, saved for someone's child. The meals were humble, but the ethics were not. And perhaps that's what made the peasant table different from the nobles. Not what was served, but how it was served. Not how rich the broth, but how deep the care. Still, these meals left their mark on the body, on the bones. Archaeologists studying medieval graves can often tell a peasant from a noble, not just by burial goods, but by diet lines in teeth and bones, stunted growth, worn joints, linear enamel hypoplasia, grooves in teeth caused by malnutrition during childhood. The peasants survived, but they paid for it every winter, every tax, every skipped meal, and they knew it. Which is why when the rare feast came, a wedding, a saint's day, a good harvest, it meant more. Not because of the meat or the wine, but because it reminded them, this isn't normal, this is joy, and joy is rare. Still, one question lingers. If the diet was simple and they were strong, why didn't they change it? Why did peasants, even in better times, still return to their lentils and leeks? We'll answer that next. They had options, sometimes a good harvest, a mild winter, a kind lord, a pig raised and salted, a few hens that didn't fall ill, a market day with coins in the pouch, and still many peasants chose peas, lentils, barley, onions, pottage, not because they had no imagination, not because they didn't crave roasted meat or crusty manchet bread, but because simplicity was safety. The pottage pot didn't just feed, it protected. It protected from risk. Meat spoiled quickly, fish turned, cream curdled, imported spices. Cost too much to replace if wasted, but lentils, peas, they waited. They held. They were stable, predictable, dull, and life-giving. More than that, they were familiar. Cooking wasn't done with recipes. It was done by memory, by repetition. Passed from mother to daughter, from wife to neighbor, from old woman to the girl peeling turnips at the door. The same stew meant fewer mistakes, fewer surprises, and less waste. Every variation had been tested, by someone, somewhere. This onion is too strong. That batch of peas gave us cramps. Don't use the red roots, they're bitter. Soak the beans longer, stir counterclockwise, add salt after it boils. And so, tradition formed, not out of culture, or ritual, but survival. Even when times improved, the old ways stayed close, because the body trusted them, because the mind found peace in them, because the pot, that old blackened pot, remembered more than the family did. In it lived decades of meals, decisions, compromises, regret. Regret that the barley didn't stretch, that the peas went moldy, that the stew didn't last until market day and still they boiled, because to boil was to plan, to hope, to gather, even as cities rose, even as diets changed, even as lords built glass-windowed kitchens and spice merchants arrived with nutmeg and ginger. The peasants stirred their pot, because in that pot was everything they needed: warmth, heaviness, routine, control. Control over one small corner of life in a world that gave them so little, and so the meal endured. Even in death, in the bones. Unearthed centuries later, scientists find evidence of legumes, grains, rough vegetables, not a gourmet legacy, but a durable one. Even now in kitchens around the world, that legacy continues. Split pea soup, dal, lentil stew, pottage, mujadara, rice and beans, all born from the same question: what can I make from almost nothing? And maybe that's the real strength of the peasant meal. Not that it kept people strong, but that it taught generations how to be patient, how to endure, how to turn hunger into habit, and habit into a kind of quiet grace. So the next time you stir a pot of lentils, when the aroma rises, when it simmers and thickens, when you taste that earthy, humble spoonful, know that you're part of a long, slow line of people who knew, this is enough, this is food, this is life. It starts quiet. A cellar. Cold, dark, damp. Stone walls sweating, wooden shelves heavy with wheels, each one aging slowly, silently, cracking, sweating, blooming. This is where the real work happened, not in the chapel, not in the scriptorium, but in the cheese room. Because medieval monasteries didn't just make cheese, they mastered it, and in doing so, they created something far more powerful than food. They created wealth, they created trade, they created cheese, worth killing for. Let's begin at the start. Cheese was already ancient by the time monks perfected it. Nomadic peoples in the Near East had discovered it by accident. Milk stored in animal stomachs curdled from the rennet inside. By the Roman era, dozens of cheeses were catalogued, pressed, smoked, wrapped in leaves, buried in ashes. But it was in the Middle Ages, particularly behind monastery walls, that cheese became art. Why monks? Because they had time, they had land, they had livestock, and they had silence. Perfect conditions for fermentation. Monasteries kept cows, goats, sheep, and most importantly, they wrote things down. They recorded methods, tested ratios, catalogued results, and passed recipes across borders. From France to Germany to Italy to Britain, they built caves for aging, developed brines, invented tools, trained novices to turn curds at just the right time, to pierce the rind, to wipe the mold. They didn't call it microbiology, but that's what it was, and soon cheese became one of their most valuable assets. Rich. Monasteries sold it across regions. Pilgrims tasted it and brought the memory home. Kings requested it for feasts. Markets demanded it in bulk. Some varieties, like Roquefort in France or Tête de Moine in Switzerland, trace directly back to monastic traditions. Others, like the soft, bloomy cheeses of Normandy, evolved from quiet experiments in abbey kitchens. But it wasn't just about flavor, it was about control, because cheese stored well. It traveled. It lasted. Unlike fresh milk, which spoiled in hours, cheese could survive a journey, be counted, be taxed, and where there is tax, there is power. Monasteries used cheese to pay debts, to fund repairs, to bribe officials, to gift. Bishops, and in some cases might have settled disputes, because cheese wasn't just food, it was currency, and like all currency, it invited greed. There are records, in abbey annals, in court transcripts, of cheese-related crimes. A novice caught sneaking wheels from the cellar. A merchant poisoned over a cheese contract. A neighboring lordsman caught raiding a monastery's aging cave at night. In one German account, a monk was found drowned in a vat of whey, foul play suspected. The cheese was never recovered in quieter ways too. The monks worked in silence, but silence doesn't mean ignorance. They knew what they had. They knew the value, they knew the hunger just beyond the walls, and they protected their cheese like treasure, because it was. Cheese wasn't just a food. It was a ledger, a promise, a wall of fat and protein and prestige that turned rot into revenue. Each wheel was marked, dated, turned at precise intervals, wrapped in cloth or straw, stacked according to age and use. Some were made for trade, pressed hard, salted heavily, built for travel. Others were soft and rich, meant for bishops, for abbots, for feast tables, where silence was briefly broken by the clink of knives and the low sound of chewing. Still others were medicinal. Yes, for it's medicinal. In a world without penicillin, moldy cheese was sometimes used to pack wounds, to draw infection, to cleanse. Monks knew this. They'd seen the results. And though they didn't understand the science, they respected the power. But outside the walls, that power wasn't always respected. Peasants weren't blind. They knew. The abbey made cheese. They smelled it on market days, saw the carts roll past, watched abbots cut thin slices for visiting lords, and they wanted in. But cheese took space. Time, salt, clean tools, a cool cellar. Things peasants didn't always have. Still, some tried. They wrapped fresh curds in herbs, buried wheels in cool earth, smoked soft rounds to keep flies out, pressed cheeses between stones, and when the local lord found out, fines, confiscation. In some cases, destruction of the illegal cheese, because control wasn't just about quality, it was about hierarchy. The monks made God's cheese. The peasants made field cheese. One was holy, one was low. But slowly the line blurred. Markets grew, trade routes expanded, towns developed, and demand increased. Suddenly, cheese wasn't just for monks and merchants. It was everywhere, and with that came tension. Monasteries feared competition. They filed complaints, appealed to bishops, restricted land leases that allowed peasant cheese caves. In return, resentment grew. And in times of scarcity, war, plague, crop failure, that resentment spilled over. There are recorded incidents. Curved cheese riots. In 1432, a French abbey's cheese cellar was raided by villagers after 2 children starved during Lent. The abbot accused them of heresy. They accused him of hoarding. Both sides quoted scripture. Neither side backed down. The cheese was never recovered. In Italy in 1490, a group of poor women from the outskirts of Siena were arrested for selling counterfeit monastery cheese, molded with ash to mimic age, wrapped in forged cloth seals. They were fined, publicly shamed, and according to the records, banned from market trade indefinitely. But the forgeries continued, because even fake holiness sells. Still, the monks adapted. Some tightened control. Others partnered with traders. Some even licensed their methods, selling the right to make certain cheeses, a quiet surrender to capitalism. And yet, the mold still bloomed, the flavor still deepened, the wheels still turned, the cellars still hummed with age, because no matter the politics, the hunger remained, and cheese, once born of preservation, had become something else entirely, a symbol of indulgence, a taste of privilege, a wheel of contradiction, humble in ingredients, divine in meaning. So what happens when that meaning curdles, when the sacred turns sour? That's what we'll explore next. By the dawn of the 16th century, the monastery cheese sellers were quieter, not silent. They still worked, still aged, still stirred curds in copper vats and wiped wheels with brine-soaked cloths. But something had shifted. The world outside had grown louder. Reform was in the air, in pulpits, in pamphlets, in the footsteps of protesters and preachers. And as the church came under scrutiny, so too did its cheese. Not literally at first, but symbolically. Because cheese, like the wealth behind stained glass, or the land hoarded behind walls, had become a symbol of distance. Distance between the monks and the people, between the church and the hungry, between what was practiced and what was preached. And in that distance, rot set in, just as a cheese left too long or turned too seldom begins to bloom with the wrong mold. So too did the monastery's reputation. In England, the dissolution of the monasteries didn't spare the cheese rooms, barrels smashed, wheels confiscated, recipes lost. Some monks fled with their cultures, literal and metaphorical, trying to recreate them in smaller cells, hidden farms, new worlds. Others gave up, or died with their ledgers. And with them, the silence of those aging caves was broken. What replaced it? Commerce. The same cheeses, now made by laymen, sold by weight, stamped not with a monk's mark but with a merchant's brand. Still delicious, still aged with care, but different, because the ritual was gone. No chants in the distance, no morning prayer over the curds, no vow of poverty in the hands that shaped the wheels. And yet, something persisted. Even today, certain cheeses carry the ghost of their origins. Trappist cheese made by silent monks in Belgium. Abbé de Belloc, still produced with a nod to monastic tradition. Saint Nectaire, born of Auvergne abbeys. Even Roquefort, aged in natural caves, whispers of early Benedictines. And beyond flavor, beyond history, beyond rind and recipe, there's memory. That once, food wasn't just food. It was prayer. It was power. It was patience. Cheese, of all things, teaches us time. That richness doesn't come fast. That rot and ripeness are close cousins. That silence, real silence, can change milk into meaning. So the next time you taste a wedge of something sharp and strange, pause. Smell. Crack the rind. Look at the lines inside, the veins, the shadows, the structure, and know that once in a cave beneath a church, someone stirred a curd by candlelight, not for wealth, not for fame, but because someone, somewhere, was hungry, and behind every quiet cheesem is a louder story. No one went hungry in the castle, not the lords, not the knights, not even the hounds, at least. That's what it looked like. In reality, behind the walls of tapestries and silver platters, a different kind of hunger grew. One that didn't gnaw at the belly, but at the joints. A slow pain, swollen toes, aching knees, fingers too stiff to hold a goblet. Gout, they called it the rich man's disease, the king's affliction, a curse of comfort. And it wasn't just an illness. It was a mirror, reflecting what went wrong when food became power. Let's begin at the sati. Table? A noble feast was more than a meal, it was theatre. Long tables draped in linen, platters of meat. Swan, boar, venison, pheasant, rabbit, ox. Pies stuffed with almonds, raisins, and spices. Fish carved into shapes. Peacocks redressed in feathers after roasting. And sauces, so many sauces, made from wine, vinegar, crushed nuts, ginger, cinnamon, saffron, and sugar. Everything had to be seasoned, shaped, decorated, transformed. Food wasn't just eaten, it was displayed. And the eating, it didn't stop. A feast could last for hours, days even, course after course, meat after meat. Ale and wine poured non-stop. Plates cleared and replaced before hunger returned. There was no concept of balanced diet. Vegetables were for the poor, or for medicine. Fruit was risky. Water was suspicious. Meat was strength. Spices were wealth. Portion size was honor. The more you could consume, the more powerful you appeared, and so they ate. Noblemen, abbots, courtiers, even kings. Especially kings. Henry VIII of England, famously, suffered from gout, often needing help to walk. Charles V of France crippled in his later years. Countless bishops and dukes with aching joints and twisted feet, their fingers swelled, their feet reddened, their movements slowed, and still they ate, because to eat less was to signal weakness. Besides, gout wasn't fully understood. Some called it divine punishment. Others blamed the stars. A few suspected wine or rich meats or heated humors. Doctors bled them, applied leeches, prescribed boiled herbs and foot baths. But nothing helped, because the cause was in the kitchen. Gout is caused by an accumulation of uric acid. Too much purine in the diet, found in red meat, organ meat, certain fish and alcohol, leads to crystal buildup in joints. In other words, the medieval feast was perfectly engineered to produce it. And yet, it didn't just cause pain. It carried prestige. A swollen foot meant you ate well. A gouty knee meant you had access. It became bizarrely a badge of success. Peasants didn't get gout. They got rickets, they got scurvy, they got hunger. But gout, that was noble. There's something tragic about that. That pain could be worn like jewelry. That meals, so rich, so colorful, so filled with spices from far-off lands, could slowly poison the people who most celebrated them. And beneath the table, servants watched, waited, licked the grease from platters, chewed on bones tossed aside, scraped leftovers into buckets. They didn't envy the nobles' food, not always. They saw the cost, the bandages, the limps, the sighs, the bitter groans. After too much wine. But what happened when the pain became too much, when the feast turned fatal? That's where we'll go next.